Russia's war in Ukraine has made it clear that Eurasian grain is an exceedingly important commodity. Russia's naval blockade of the Black Sea prevented Ukrainian grain from reaching global consumers from February to July 2022, creating enormous logistical and economic problems for Ukrainian farmers and driving up global market prices for food commodities, already at a historic high at the time. Russia has tried to use leverage over Eurasian grain exports to negotiate concessions in the West's sanctions regime. In other words, it has tried to weaponize food. In this video, we will explain why Eurasian grain is important for Russia, Ukraine, and the world. Though oil and gas are Russia's most important export, Eurasian grain has long been a vital resource. In the 19th century, Eurasian grain fed hungry workers in European cities. Today, it keeps domestic food prices low in Russia and Ukraine, generates export revenues, and feeds the growing populations in countries in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia that rely on food imports. Eurasian grain's current role owes much to its 20th century history. At the turn of the century, the Bolshevik revolutionaries put land and food high on the agenda. To gain popular support, Lenin had promised land, bread, and peace to the Russian people. Russian and Ukrainian farms today are very large, in part because of the radical reforms implemented by the Soviet government in the 1920s and 30s. Massive, violent collectivization in the 1930s created very large farms while completely severing villagers' claims to the land that they had tilled for generations. Collective and state farms, known as kolkhoze and sovkhoze, fed the growing ranks of urban workers for the remainder of the 20th century. For the most part, they made bread and basic staples available to all, though meat and other desirables remained in short supply, except for party elites in urban centers. Shortages led the Soviet Union to import grain for livestock feed from the US in the 1970s, and often drove Soviet citizens to grow their own small gardens and keep some farm animals at home. When the Soviet Union and the planned economy collapsed in 1991, Russian agricultural production plunged into crisis. Liberalized markets meant that Russian farms had to compete with overwhelming competition from foreign agricultural and food producers. Collective farms were privatized during that time, but many of them went bankrupt, and very large stretches of farmland were fallowed. Reversing the collapse of domestic agriculture was a central concern for Vladimir Putin when he became president in 2000. As it had been for successive Soviet leaders before him. Over the last 20 years, the Putin government has consistently supported agricultural producers through various policy tools and an evolving series of programs, such as trade restrictions, subsidized credits, and agricultural insurance, tax breaks, and investments in physical infrastructure to modernize the technology used in agriculture. The most high-profile policy initiative was the National Food Security Doctrine, which was explicitly coordinated with the country's national security policy. The doctrine had two main goals: keeping food prices low and making some foods, especially meat and dairy, more widely available for domestic consumers. Its centerpiece was a set of precise and ambitious self-sufficiency targets for the staples of the Russian diet. This food security agenda also had a foreign policy dimension. The Putin government was dismayed by its dependence on foreign food imports and wanted to reduce them while strengthening Russia's export capacity, particularly for wheat, the country's main grain crop. These policies were quite successful. Russian agricultural production not only recovered, but rapidly increased production volumes, yields, and for some commodities, even exports. Russian wheat in particular rapidly gained global market shares, and Russia became the world's largest wheat exporter. To understand how this agricultural boom was possible, we need to discuss a new type of farm that emerged in this period: the agro-holdings.
The agro-holdings are large, vertically integrated companies. Vertical integration means that these companies control activities along the agricultural value chains, from fields to seeds to finished food products in the store. Miratorg, for example, is one of Russia's largest meat producers. Its slogan says that it operates from field to counter. Because the agro-holdings control so much of the food supply, they became what I call the privileged allies of the Putin government. The technology that these companies use, the tractors, the fertilizer, the pesticides, and the seeds, were initially imported from the United States and Europe. In recent years, the Russian government has tried to promote the recovery of domestic Russian agro-technologies. Russian authorities came to think of agricultural technologies in political terms, viewing them as tools that Russian farmers and food processors need to reduce the country's dependency on Western countries.
Generous and sustained government support for agro-holdings over the last 20 years has had far-reaching consequences. These corporations accumulated control of Russia's most fertile farmland. Agro-holdings were encouraged to increase their land banks by regional and federal authorities, who saw this as a way to foster economic development in their regions. A second important consequence is that Russian diets have changed quite significantly compared to the 1990s, as well as to the Soviet period. Technologies increased the scale of meat production and lowered costs, thereby bringing more meat to Russian tables. Russians now also eat more fast food and convenience foods, such as chicken nuggets and frozen pizza. Finally, with the rising export capacity, Russia's relationship to food importing countries has also changed. Grain exports give Russia leverage to influence the policies of countries that rely on wheat imports, such as Egypt, Turkey, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. Some Russian government officials have actively tried to use grain as a foreign policy tool, although global grain markets are highly competitive, and until recently, this has not worked well. The war with Ukraine has changed the global grain geopolitics in ways that we will explain next. Ukraine has also undergone a domestic agricultural revolution. Wheat, corn, and sunflowers are Ukraine's most important agricultural products. The country has been particularly successful in growing corn and sunflower seeds. Ukraine's fertile soil, its long and warm growing season, and ample rainfall are all conducive to growing these commodities that are in high demand in the global food system. Dr. Vitaly Dunkevich, an agricultural economist from Zhytomyr, Ukraine, summarized Ukraine's agricultural renaissance as follows.
Ukraine is a country with very fertile soil. Agriculture was Ukraine's fastest-growing economic sector in the 5 years before the war, and it's the single large export commodity. In 2021, Ukraine accounted for 15% of global corn exports, 10% of global wheat exports, and nearly 40% of global sunflower seeds. China and Europe were Ukrainians' main trading partners. Before the war, Ukraine accounted for 80% of China corn import. China also promised to invest in Ukraine infrastructure port.
Russia's war on Ukraine has wreaked grievous harm on Ukrainian farms. Andrei Vadotersky, the CEO of Nibelon, one of Ukraine's largest agro-holdings, stated, "The war has seriously disrupted our business operations. Large areas of agricultural production, grain elevators, and river terminals are now in occupied territories, and we have approximately $92 million in fixed assets that are intact but inaccessible in these areas." We have not been able to use our shipping fleet at all because of the blockage of seaports and the passage of rivers through the occupied territories. We are, therefore, actively rerouting our exports via land routes, but at a much higher cost. This caused our exports to drop significantly. From January 1st to November 15th, 2022, Nibelon exported 1.7 million tons of grain, a 164% decrease from the same period in 2021. These wartime disruptions have been felt across Ukraine's agricultural industry. The UN estimates Ukraine's agricultural sector, in total, has suffered damages and losses of $30.5 billion. Professor Wengle and Professor Donkiewicz have examined the different forms of damage to Ukrainian farms. Based on this analysis, they argue that the Russian military is deliberately targeting key farming-related properties with the aim of inflicting short- and long-term harm. An important aspect of Ukraine's agricultural economy is that virtually all of the country's export crops reach global markets via the Black Sea. The most important turning point for farmers was the establishment of the grain corridor under the auspices of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, BSGI, which brought a limited and temporary easing of the blockade as part of an agreement between Ukraine and Russia. The agreement was brokered by Turkey and signed in Istanbul on July 22nd, and renewed 2 more times in November 2022 and in March 2023. The partial easing of Russia's blockade had significant economic consequences for Ukraine and the world. Ukraine's export earnings recovered, while global food commodity prices fell. Professors Wengle and Donkiewicz argue that the Black Sea Grain Initiative, BSGI, is a limited, politically tenuous stopgap measure. It is a better-than-nothing solution against the backdrop of Russia's continued control of the Black Sea region. While we generally think of oil and gas as Russia's most important export, we should not forget that grain is a vitally important export for both Russia and Ukraine. Both countries have fertile soils and have become efficient and productive grain exporters, feeding the world's growing urban population.